Welcome. We find ourselves navigating a cultural moment deeply invested in the idea of safety, an almost obsessive preoccupation with shielding individuals from potential emotional or psychological harm. This concern, while often presented with the best intentions, has given rise to a peculiar and now ubiquitous phenomenon, the trigger warning. You see them everywhere. Preceding articles, attached to university course descriptions, flashed before films or television shows, sometimes even offered verbally before a potentially sensitive conversation. The stated purpose is straightforward: to alert people to content, words, images, themes that might evoke a distressing response, particularly in those who have experienced trauma, allowing them to prepare themselves or simply opt out. It sounds considerate, perhaps even necessary, a gesture of collective care in an often harsh world. But what if this widespread practice, this cultural reflex towards preemptive cushioning, is not the benign act of compassion it appears to be? What if, beneath the surface of well-meaning solicitude, lies a mechanism that actively undermines psychological development, fosters an environment of emotional fragility, and in a profound sense, contributes to a slow, creeping death of the human soul? In this video, we are going to undertake a serious examination of this provocative claim. Our exploration will not be guided by the shifting winds of political debate or the fleeting outrage cycles of social media, but by the enduring, challenging insights of depth psychology, specifically the work of Carl Jung. We will put forth the argument that trigger warnings, far from being a progressive tool enhancing empathy, represent a fundamental misunderstanding of psychic health and a dangerous detour from the necessary, albeit often difficult, path towards psychological wholeness, a path Jung famously called individuation. This journey, Jung insisted, requires not the avoidance of darkness, but its courageous confrontation and integration. It is time we ask ourselves honestly, are we building safe havens for vulnerable souls, or are we constructing ornate prisons for the human spirit, inadvertently starving it of the very experiences it needs to grow strong, resilient, and complete? In a way, Jung's timeless wisdom strikes back against a modern culture seemingly terrified of its own complexities, reminding us that the soul achieves vitality not in sterile comfort, but in the rich, challenging, and often shadowed landscape of lived reality. The ascent of the trigger warning from a niche practice to a pervasive cultural norm warrants careful attention. Its origins can be traced back to early online communities, particularly feminist forums and mental health support groups in the initial decades of the Internet. Within these specific contexts, it functioned as a form of peer-to-peer courtesy, a way for individuals sharing intensely personal and potentially traumatic stories to give others within that community a heads up, acknowledging shared vulnerabilities and allowing for informed engagement. It was an organic practice, born from specific needs within contained groups. However, what began as a localized consideration soon underwent a significant expansion. It migrated into academic environments, initially sparking debate around syllabi for courses covering potentially disturbing material such as graphic violence, sexual assault, racism, or historical atrocities. This ignited fierce discussions on university campuses worldwide about the core purpose of education, the balance between intellectual freedom and student well-being, and the assumed resilience or fragility of young minds. From the halls of academia, the practice rapidly permeated the broader cultural landscape. Major news organizations began incorporating content warnings. Social media platforms implemented sensitivity filters, requiring users to click through to view potentially upsetting posts. Museums started placing advisory notices near certain exhibits, and even corporate communications adopted similar cautionary language. Throughout this expansion, the underlying rationale remained largely consistent. The belief that certain words, images, or ideas could function as triggers, capable of reactivating traumatic memories and inducing significant psychological distress, often drawing parallels to the flashbacks associated with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Therefore, providing advance notice is framed as an act of empowerment, allowing individuals to manage their exposure by either mentally preparing themselves or choosing complete avoidance. This narrative possesses a strong emotional appeal. The call for empathy, the desire to prevent unnecessary suffering, and the aim to create more inclusive and safer spaces resonate deeply with contemporary values. Who could argue against being considerate of others' pain? Yet, it is precisely at this juncture, where the practice seems most obviously virtuous, that a more critical, psychologically informed examination must commence. We need to look beyond the surface intentions, however laudable, and scrutinize the actual psychological mechanisms being engaged and the potential unintended consequences of normalizing this behavior on a mass scale. The fundamental psychological premise supporting the widespread, non-clinical application of trigger warnings is surprisingly unstable when subjected to scrutiny. Firstly, and perhaps most significantly from a therapeutic perspective, trigger warnings actively encourage and normalize avoidance as a primary coping strategy. While avoidance may provide temporary relief from anxiety or discomfort, it is universally recognized within clinical psychology as a maladaptive behavior that lies at the very core of anxiety disorders, phobias, and the maintenance of PTSD symptoms. By consistently sidestepping situations, thoughts, or stimuli associated with past trauma or current fear, an individual inadvertently reinforces two damaging beliefs. First, that the avoided stimulus is inherently dangerous and unmanageable, and second, that they themselves lack the internal capacity to cope with the associated feelings. This directly prevents the natural psychological processes of habituation, through which repeated, safe exposure to a feared stimulus gradually diminishes the anxiety response, and emotional processing, the crucial work of integrating difficult memories and emotions into one's broader life narrative in a way that reduces their disruptive power. Indeed, the most effective evidence-based treatments for trauma and anxiety disorders, such as exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy, CPT, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, EMDR, are all fundamentally predicated on the principle of guided, structured confrontation with feared stimuli, memories, or thoughts, not their avoidance. These therapies work precisely because systematic exposure within a safe therapeutic relationship allows for new learning and emotional integration to occur. Trigger warnings, as they function in general society, operate as the direct opposite of this therapeutic principle. They serve as institutionalized prompts for avoidance, implicitly validating the very behavior that clinical interventions aim to modify. The underlying message communicated is, this content might be distressing, potential danger lies ahead, retreating is a perfectly acceptable, perhaps even advisable, response. This fosters a mindset fundamentally antithetical to the cultivation of psychological resilience. Resilience is not a fixed trait one is born with. It is a dynamic capacity developed through experience, specifically through the experience of successfully navigating challenges, processing uncomfortable emotions, and learning through direct evidence that one can withstand and even grow from adversity. A culture saturated with warnings against potential emotional discomfort implicitly instructs individuals, particularly young people, forming their identities and worldviews within educational settings, to perceive themselves as inherently fragile, easily broken by words, images, or challenging ideas. It frames encounters with difficult material not as potential opportunities for intellectual expansion, emotional maturation, or the strengthening of coping skills, but primarily as sources of potential psychological harm. Think of building physical strength. It requires resistance, pushing muscles slightly beyond their comfort zone. Psychological fortitude is built analogously by facing difficulties, working through the associated discomfort, and discovering our innate capacity to endure, adapt, and integrate challenging experiences. The pervasive ethos of trigger warnings sends the opposite message. You are delicate. Discomfort equals danger. Avoidance is strength. This leads inevitably towards a problematic externalization of the locus of control regarding one's emotional states. An internal locus of control, the belief that one has agency over one's responses and can influence outcomes, is strongly correlated with positive mental health indicators, including greater self-efficacy, reduced anxiety, and enhanced resilience. Conversely, an external locus of control, the belief that one's feelings and fate are primarily determined by external forces beyond one's influence, is linked to increased anxiety, depression, learned helplessness, and a tendency towards perceiving oneself as a victim. Trigger warnings inherently promote an external locus of control concerning emotional regulation. They subtly shift the perceived responsibility for managing one's potential emotional reactions away from the individual and onto the external environment, the speaker, the writer, the institution, the algorithm, which is expected to anticipate and preemptively neutralize any possible source of distress. This process disempowers individuals, eroding the expectation and the crucial practice of developing their own internal resources, their own skills for navigating difficult feelings. It cultivates a reliance on external validation and protection, rather than fostering internal strength, emotional intelligence, and the self-reliance necessary for navigating a complex world. Furthermore, there is an undeniable current of infantilization running through the widespread trigger warning culture. As a society, we generally accept that a core part of maturing into adulthood involves learning to cope with disappointment, frustration, disagreement, loss, failure, and exposure to the often harsh, complex, and unpleasant realities of human history and the human condition. We do not, nor should we, aspire to create a world entirely sterilized of anything potentially upsetting, offensive, or challenging. Yet, the indiscriminate application of trigger warnings, especially within contexts like higher education, often treats adults as if they possess the emotional fragility of young children, requiring constant shielding from potentially difficult ideas or realistic depictions of the world. This practice fundamentally underestimates the capacity of students and adults for critical engagement, nuanced emotional processing, intellectual resilience, and the ability to navigate ambiguity and discomfort. Great works of literature, transformative pieces of art, essential historical accounts, and profound philosophical inquiries frequently engage with themes of violence, injustice, suffering, mental anguish, betrayal, and existential dread. They do so not for shock value, but because these are inescapable dimensions of the human experience that demand our contemplation, understanding, and ethical reflection. to routinely preface Shakespeare's tragedies like King Lear or Macbeth, historical analyses of the Holocaust or slavery, philosophical explorations of nihilism or evil, or novels depicting psychological trauma with trigger warnings is not only practically unwieldy, but risks fundamentally misrepresenting their cultural and pedagogical value. It frames these vital works primarily as potential hazards to be navigated cautiously, rather than as indispensable opportunities for developing empathy, grappling with profound moral complexities, expanding historical consciousness, achieving intellectual breakthroughs, and fostering emotional maturation. It is precisely at this critical juncture, this tension between the impulse to avoid discomfort and the necessity of engagement for growth, that the profound insights of Carl Jung offer a crucial, illuminating, and corrective perspective. Jung's depth psychology presents a model of the human psyche that stands in stark opposition to the emphasis on surface comfort and avoidance implicitly promoted by trigger warning culture. For Jung, the ultimate aim of psychological development, the lifelong process he termed individuation, is not achieved through seeking perpetual ease or sidestepping pain. On the contrary, it necessitates a courageous, conscious confrontation and subsequent integration of the totality of the psyche, explicitly including its most difficult, repressed, and shadowy aspects. Central to Jung's entire psychological edifice is the concept of the shadow. The shadow archetype represents all those aspects of our personality that we deem unacceptable, inferior, embarrassing, or incompatible with our conscious self-image, our socially acceptable persona. It comprises our repressed desires, our socially taboo impulses, our primitive instincts, our irrational fears, our unresolved traumas, our moral failings, our undeveloped potentials, essentially the dark side of our nature that we prefer to deny exists within us. The shadow is formed through a combination of personal experiences, parental and societal conditioning, and cultural values, which lead us to push certain aspects of ourselves into the unconscious because they conflict with our ego ideal or the prevailing collective norms. Crucially, Jung did not conceptualize the shadow as inherently evil or purely negative. While it contains destructive potential, it also holds immense vitality, creativity, authenticity, and undeveloped strengths. The real psychological danger arises not from the shadow itself, but when it remains wholly unconscious, unacknowledged, and unintegrated. An unacknowledged shadow does not simply lie dormant. It operates autonomously from the darkness of the unconscious, projecting its contents onto the external world. We unconsciously attribute our own denied flaws, unacceptable impulses, unresolved fears, and aggressions onto other individuals, groups, or situations. This psychological mechanism of projection fuels prejudice, interpersonal conflict, scapegoating, moral righteousness, intense and seemingly irrational emotional reactions to external events, and a distorted perception of reality. From this Jungian perspective, trigger warnings can be interpreted as cultural mechanisms that actively facilitate the continued repression and denial of the shadow, both on a personal and a collective level. By signaling potential danger and encouraging avoidance of content that might evoke strong negative emotions, fear, anger, disgust, grief, shame, anxiety, they discourage the very encounters that can serve as potent catalysts for bringing denied shadow material into conscious awareness. Difficult art, challenging literature, uncomfortable historical truths, controversial ideas, and dissenting opinions often resonate powerfully and disturb us precisely because they touch upon these repressed, archetypal themes, dwelling within the collective unconscious and our personal psychic underworlds. They function as mirrors, reflecting back aspects of ourselves and our shared human inheritance that our conscious ego would much prefer to ignore or disown. Avoiding these mirrors, a behavior actively facilitated and normalized by trigger warnings, means systematically foregoing invaluable opportunities for crucial self-knowledge, honest self-confrontation, the withdrawal of projections, and the vital work of psychological integration. Jung was unequivocally clear that confronting the shadow, courageously acknowledging its presence within us, taking responsibility for its contents by withdrawing our projections from others, and consciously working to integrate its energy and insights into the larger personality is absolutely essential for achieving psychological health, maturity, ethical development, and genuine wholeness. This is demanding, often painful psychological work, akin to the descent into the underworld depicted in countless myths. It requires profound honesty, considerable courage, humility, and a sustained willingness to embrace uncomfortable, often unflattering truths about oneself. Trigger warnings offer a seductive, seemingly compassionate bypass around this difficult labor, a way to keep the potentially disruptive contents of the shadow safely contained and out of sight. But this perceived safety is illusory and comes at an exorbitant price: the sacrifice of authenticity, vitality, psychological depth, and the ultimate possibility of achieving genuine psychic integration and wholeness. This leads directly to Jung's central overarching concept, individuation. Individuation is the innate, lifelong psychological process through which a human being becomes a psychologically distinct, indivisible unity or whole. It involves differentiating oneself from the unconscious influence of collective norms, expectations, and archetypal patterns, developing a conscious and dynamic relationship with the unconscious depths of one's own psyche, integrating the various archetypal components, the ego as the center of consciousness, the shadow, the anima-animus complex representing the contrasexual soul image, and others, and ultimately realizing, or at least striving towards, the self. The self, in Jungian psychology, is the central archetype of order, meaning, and wholeness, the unifying center of the total personality, encompassing both conscious and unconscious realms, which transcends and relativizes the ego. The journey of individuation is inherently arduous, complex, and fraught with challenges, setbacks, and periods of disorientation. It demands navigating intense internal and external conflicts, learning to hold the tension between opposing forces within the psyche without collapsing into one side. Forces like good and evil, light and dark, masculine and feminine principles, conscious reason and unconscious instinct, individual desires and collective responsibilities. It involves questioning deeply ingrained assumptions about oneself and the world, confronting painful personal and historical realities, wrestling with existential questions of meaning and mortality, and integrating peak experiences alongside experiences of profound suffering. It is, fundamentally, a journey into increasing psychological complexity, moral ambiguity, personal responsibility, and profound depth. Trigger warnings, by their very nature of promoting the avoidance of the difficult, the challenging, the ambiguous, and the disturbing, function as significant obstacles on this essential human path of individuation. They encourage psychological stagnation by shielding the individual from the necessary psychic friction, the challenging encounters and internal conflicts that stimulate psychic movement adaptation, and growth. If individuation is fundamentally about expanding consciousness, differentiating the ego from the unconscious, and integrating the vast, often turbulent realm of the unconscious into a larger, more resilient whole, then trigger warnings serve to maintain a constricted, fragile, and defended conscious state, perpetually fearful of encountering anything that might perturb its carefully managed but ultimately incomplete and brittle reality. They reinforce the fragmentation of the psyche, preventing the vital synthesis of opposites, the conjunctio oppositorum that Jung identified as the hallmark of psychological maturity, wisdom, resilience, and the gradual realization of the self. And this brings us back, with renewed understanding, to the provocative core assertion: trigger warnings, through their cumulative cultural effect and the psychological attitudes they foster, contribute to a subtle but significant killing of the soul. What precisely is meant by soul in this specific context? For Jung, and for the perspective adopted in this video, the psyche or soul refers to the totality of all psychological processes, both conscious and unconscious. It is the vibrant, dynamic, animating principle within each human being, the seat of our deepest emotions, our imagination, our creativity, our capacity for symbolic life, our sense of meaning, our connection to the numinous, and our subjective experience of being truly alive and engaged with the world. It is not necessarily a theological entity, but rather the locus of our inner world and its connection to outer reality. Jung believed passionately, based on his extensive clinical experience and study of world mythology and religion, that the soul requires specific forms of nourishment to thrive, to deepen, and to maintain its vitality. This essential nourishment comes not solely from pleasant, harmonious, or positive experiences, but crucially from engaging with the full, unexpurgated spectrum of life, including its inherent suffering, its unavoidable paradoxes, its profound mysteries, and its inescapable darkness. The soul deepens, gains substance, finds resilience, and discovers meaning through grappling with profound existential questions, confronting mortality and loss, experiencing the heights of joy and the depths of despair, wrestling with moral dilemmas, engaging with the powerful archetypal patterns embedded in myths, stories, dreams, art, religion, and navigating challenging life experiences that push us beyond our previous limits. Trigger warnings, by systematically encouraging the avoidance of anything deemed potentially triggering or emotionally challenging, effectively place the soul on a restricted, impoverished diet. They promote the consumption of bland, easily digestible, psychologically superficial fare, shielding us from the rich, complex, sometimes bitter, but ultimately essential nutrients required for developing psychological depth, robust character, authentic wisdom, and enduring meaning. A soul perpetually shielded from difficulty, from the tragic dimension of existence, from the disturbing truths about human nature and history, becomes shallow, etiolated, brittle, and increasingly disconnected from the vital, instinctual, archetypal currents of life itself. It loses its resilience, its capacity for profound feeling, both positive and negative, its ability to metabolize suffering into meaning and growth, and its connection to the transpersonal or archetypal ground of being that provides orientation and a sense of belonging in the cosmos. Consider the impact on our engagement with the great traditions of art and literature. Masterpieces like Homer's Iliad, Sophocles' Antigone, Dante's Inferno, Shakespeare's Hamlet, Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, Melville's Moby Dick, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, Toni Morrison's Beloved, or visual works like Goya's Black Paintings, Munch's The Scream, Picasso's Guernica, or Francis Bacon's distorted figures are profoundly unsettling, challenging, and often deeply disturbing. They confront us directly with the brutality of war, civil disobedience and its consequences, eternal damnation, existential angst and revenge, murder and psychological torment, obsessive madness, mental illness, the enduring trauma of slavery, the horrors of political violence, and the grotesque fragmentation of the modern psyche. According to the logic underpinning trigger warnings, these cornerstones of human culture should all be heavily flagged, potentially discouraging countless individuals from the transformative experience of engaging with them. Yet it is precisely through wrestling with such powerful, complex, and disturbing works that we expand our understanding of the human condition in its terrifying and beautiful totality, develop deeper and more nuanced empathy, not just for victims, but also for perpetrators and those caught in tragic dilemmas, confront profound ethical complexities without easy answers, touch upon the enduring mysteries of fate, free will, suffering, redemption, and resilience, and ultimately enrich and deepen our own souls. To systematically sanitize our cultural and educational landscapes, to constantly erect warning signs before any potentially challenging psychic territory, is to rob ourselves and future generations of these indispensable opportunities for soul-making. It leads inevitably towards a demonstrable loss of depth in our individual and collective engagement with the world. Meaning, as thinkers from Jung to Viktor Frankl have powerfully argued, is rarely discovered in the relentless pursuit of pleasure or the steadfast avoidance of pain. It is far more often forged in the crucible of adversity, in the courageous confrontation with what challenges, disturbs, demands something significant from us, and forces us to grow beyond our previous limitations. By prioritizing emotional comfort and the avoidance of psychological distress above almost all other values, including truth, beauty, intellectual rigor, historical accuracy, artistic freedom, and authentic psychological growth, we risk cultivating a culture that is increasingly wide in its access to superficial information, but desperately shallow in its capacity for genuine wisdom. Hyper-connected technologically, but profoundly disconnected psychically and interpersonally. Adept at managing surfaces and appearances, but terrified of exploring the depths within ourselves and our shared reality. The consequent erosion of psychological resilience is another critical facet of this soul-killing process. The human psyche, much like the biological immune system or a physical muscle, strengthens through exposure, challenge, and successful adaptation. By systematically avoiding emotional discomfort, intellectual challenges, and difficult psychological experiences, we prevent the development of the crucial psychological antibodies of resilience, effective coping mechanisms, robust emotional regulation skills, increased distress tolerance, cognitive flexibility, perspective-taking abilities, and a core belief in one's capacity to overcome adversity. When genuine crises inevitably strike, as they do in every human life, in forms such as personal loss, serious illness, professional failure, betrayal, social rejection, economic hardship, or witnessing societal upheaval, individuals who have been conditioned by a culture of avoidance to expect and demand a perpetually comfortable, non-threatening environment are left tragically unprepared and vulnerable. They are more prone to psychological decompensation, less capable of finding meaning or mobilizing inner strength in the face of adversity, more likely to descend into prolonged states of anxiety, depression, bitterness, or debilitating victimhood narratives. The soul needs to know its own inherent strength, its capacity to withstand darkness and navigate storms. But it can only truly acquire this deep, embodied knowledge through direct experience, not through perpetual sheltering in safe harbors. Furthermore, the pervasive culture of trigger warnings casts a significant chilling pall over creative expression, intellectual inquiry, pedagogical innovation, and open, honest discourse. Artists, writers, filmmakers, musicians, educators, researchers, journalists, and even ordinary individuals engaging in everyday conversations may increasingly practice self-censorship, consciously or unconsciously shying away from difficult, controversial, complex, ambiguous, or potentially upsetting topics for fear of inadvertently causing offense, provoking online backlash, facing institutional repercussions, or being accused of inflicting psychological harm. This trend leads inevitably towards a blander, more conformist, less courageous, risk-averse cultural output, one that hesitates to explore the shadowy, complex, morally ambiguous, and often disturbing territories of human experience that have traditionally been the richest sources of profound art and insight. Important conversations about history, politics, social justice, psychology, morality, religion, and the very nature of human existence become fraught with peril, transformed into conversational minefields where the fear of triggering someone often outweighs the pursuit of truth, mutual understanding, authentic connection, or necessary societal critique. This dynamic impoverishes our collective intellectual and cultural life, silencing necessary dissenting voices, marginalizing challenging perspectives, discouraging nuance, and hindering the vital processes of societal self-reflection and collective psychological maturation. The soul of a culture, too, can atrophy and lose its vitality when it becomes systematically afraid of difficult dialogues, uncomfortable truths, and the exploration of its own shadows. There exists a profound and tragic paradox at the very heart of this relentless contemporary pursuit of emotional safety. The very effort to create perfectly safe, predictable, non-triggering external environments is not only ultimately doomed to fail. Life itself is inherently unpredictable, frequently painful, filled with ambiguity, and stubbornly refuses to conform to our desires for perpetual comfort and control. But it can paradoxically create a far more dangerous and fragile internal world. By failing to actively cultivate the necessary inner resources needed to cope effectively with distress, challenge, and uncertainty, individuals become more psychologically brittle, more easily overwhelmed by minor setbacks, more dependent on external validation, and ultimately more psychologically vulnerable when inevitably confronted with the unavoidable difficulties and tragedies inherent in the human condition. True, enduring psychological safety, the kind that provides a secure base for exploration, growth, risk-taking, and flourishing, does not arise from attempting to bubble wrap the external world or eliminate all potential sources of discomfort. It arises from the internal landscape, from cultivating inner strength, developing robust emotional intelligence, fostering self-awareness, increasing distress tolerance, building effective coping strategies, and nurturing the fundamental resilience required to face reality in all its complexity, beauty, and harshness. The soul finds its authentic sanctuary not in the avoidance of life's storms, but in its own developed, embodied capacity to navigate them, to endure, and ultimately to transform challenging experience into wisdom, compassion, and strength. Jung's comprehensive psychology, therefore, stands as a powerful, necessary, and timely counter-narrative to the prevailing cultural ethos of trigger warnings and excessive emotional safetyism. It issues a clarion call not for the pursuit of comfort, but for the cultivation of psychological courage. It champions the essential wisdom of embracing the tension of opposites, recognizing that light cannot be known without darkness. Strength is forged primarily through overcoming adversity, and genuine wholeness necessitates the conscious integration of all aspects of the self, including, most especially, the feared, rejected, and denied shadow. It urges each individual to undertake the demanding but profoundly rewarding archetypal journey of individuation, a path that requires, by its very definition, confronting our personal limitations, our collective histories, our unconscious biases, and the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and the intricate web of human existence. It teaches, through countless examples from mythology, religion, and clinical practice, that suffering and psychological difficulty are not merely pathological aberrations to be eliminated at all costs, but are often the very catalysts for significant personal transformation, the painful birthplaces of compassion, the discovery of enduring meaning, the deepening of character, and the awakening and tempering of the soul. This path requires a fundamental and challenging shift in perspective, acknowledging that the human psyche is not a delicate, fragile object needing constant external protection like a precious vase, but rather a dynamic, resilient, profoundly adaptable, and intrinsically growth-oriented entity that becomes stronger, deeper, and more capable through active, conscious engagement with the full, messy, often painful, yet ultimately enriching spectrum of reality. It means consciously choosing to value psychological depth over superficial comfort, enduring resilience over cultivated fragility, and authentic self-knowledge, however unsettling it may initially be, over blissful ignorance or willful denial. Now, it remains essential to inject a crucial note of nuance and clarification into this extended critique. The argument presented throughout this video is directed squarely and specifically at the widespread, indiscriminate, culturally normalized, often institutionalized, and frequently mandated use of trigger warnings in general society, particularly within the vital domains of education, art, media, and everyday public discourse. It is emphatically not intended to dismiss or minimize the devastating reality of severe psychological trauma, or to deny the potential utility of carefully considered, specific content advisories when employed judiciously within very specific, controlled clinical contexts by trained professionals. A qualified therapist working intensively with a patient suffering from severe, complex PTSD might, for instance, strategically and ethically manage exposure to potentially triggering material as an integral part of a structured, evidence-based treatment plan aimed at facilitating gradual desensitization, emotional processing, and trauma integration. That, however, represents a targeted, professional, therapeutic intervention meticulously tailored to an individual's specific diagnosis, history, and therapeutic needs. It is vastly different from, and should not be carelessly conflated with, the generalized societal practice of preemptively flagging any potentially upsetting content for the entire population, regardless of individual background, resilience level, or context. The intention behind many individuals who use or advocate for trigger warnings may indeed spring from genuine sources of compassion, a sincere and understandable desire to be considerate of others' potential pain and past experiences, and a wish to create more welcoming environments. However, as history repeatedly teaches us, positive intentions do not automatically guarantee positive or even neutral outcomes, especially when the underlying psychological assumptions guiding the actions are flawed or incomplete. The core problem, as argued here, lies in the vast over-application and normalization. the transformation of what might be a marginal clinical consideration or a specific community courtesy into a pervasive cultural norm that fundamentally misunderstands and ultimately undermines the core principles of psychological health, robust development, and enduring resilience, as illuminated by profound psychological traditions like Jung's depth psychology. This trend tragically mistakes sensitivity for inherent fragility and confuses genuine, empowering care, which involves fostering strength, capacity, and autonomy, with mere superficial protectionism, which often breeds dependence, stagnation, and weakness. Genuine care, viewed through a Jungian lens, involves supporting and facilitating the individual's arduous but essential journey towards greater consciousness and wholeness. This includes developing the inner capacity to confront life's inevitable challenges, integrate the personal and collective shadow, navigate emotional complexity with increasing skill, and discover authentic sources of meaning, even, or perhaps especially, in the midst of suffering. It means actively nurturing the soul's inherent potential for growth, depth, and transformation, not attempting to shield it from the very conditions and experiences that make such growth possible. So what are the larger long-term implications if this cultural trend towards pervasive avoidance and hypersensitivity continues unchecked on its current trajectory? We risk cultivating future generations who possess an ingrained fear of emotional discomfort, lacking the fundamental psychological tools, the experiential wisdom, and the psychic muscle needed to navigate personal adversity and complex societal challenges effectively and constructively. We risk seeing our vital educational institutions increasingly shy away from difficult but essential subjects, controversial ideas, and challenging texts, producing graduates who are less equipped for rigorous critical thinking, open intellectual debate, engagement with diverse and challenging perspectives, and the demands of active citizenship in a complex world. We risk witnessing artistic and cultural expression become progressively more sanitized, timid, predictable, and unwilling to explore the profound, disturbing, ambiguous, and ultimately illuminating depths of the human condition, leading to cultural stagnation. We risk fostering a society that is ever more fragmented, polarized, fearful, and incapable of engaging in meaningful, difficult dialogue across differences. A society where empathy is distorted into a demand for others to manage one's internal state, and communication is perpetually shut down by the preemptive fear of causing offense or triggering distress. The very resilience, dynamism, intellectual vitality, and psychological depth of our shared culture are profoundly threatened when the avoidance of psychic pain becomes elevated to a primary organizing principle, overshadowing the necessary pursuit of truth, beauty, wisdom, justice, and authentic human connection. Carl Jung's profound and enduring body of work serves as a vital, urgent reminder that the human psyche is inherently paradoxical, containing multitudes and driven by complex, often opposing forces. It seeks both safety and challenge, comfort and growth, connection and differentiation, integration of the known and exploration of the unknown. A culture that becomes obsessively focused only on the safety and comfort side of this fundamental equation creates a dangerous and unsustainable imbalance. It denies the psyche, both individual and collective, fully half of what it intrinsically needs to truly thrive, to become robust, adaptable, creative, and whole. The striking back of Jungian thought in this contemporary context is essentially an impassioned plea to restore that vital, life-giving balance. It is a call to rediscover the enduring importance of psychological courage, to revalue the transformative potential inherent in facing difficulty, to understand that true, lasting strength is forged primarily in the conscious integration of our shadows, not in their perpetual denial or projection. It is an invitation to honor the soul's deep, innate need for richness, complexity, ambiguity, challenge, and meaning. Qualities that are often found precisely within the challenging, uncomfortable, and allegedly triggering experiences. We are increasingly encouraged, institutionally and culturally, to avoid at all costs. In conclusion, while trigger warnings might present themselves on the surface as small, considerate, perhaps even ethically necessary gestures, mere informational aids offered in the spirit of kindness and inclusion, their cumulative cultural impact, when examined through the penetrating and psychologically sophisticated lens of Jungian depth psychology, appears far more problematic, insidious, and potentially destructive to long-term psychic health. By systematically promoting avoidance over engagement, cultivating fragility over resilience, externalizing emotional responsibility rather than fostering internal capacity, infantilizing individuals rather than empowering them, and ultimately obstructing the essential, archetypal human journey of individuation. They risk starving the psyche of the very experiences required for genuine growth, robust resilience, authentic meaning, and profound depth. They risk contributing in a subtle but pervasive way to a gradual killing of the soul, both individually and collectively, leaving us potentially safer in the short term, but weaker, shallower, and less alive in the long run. Perhaps the time has come for us, individually and as a culture, to critically reassess our escalating preoccupation with emotional safetyism and to consciously embrace a different, more challenging, yet ultimately more rewarding paradigm of care, one that actively fosters courage, encourages deep and thoughtful engagement with difficulty, values resilience, and places profound trust in the remarkable, inherent capacity of the human spirit, not merely to endure life's inevitable challenges, but to be fundamentally strengthened, deepened, enriched, and transformed by them. The path Jung illuminated towards wholeness is undeniably arduous, demanding considerable effort, honesty, and courage from each of us. But it is a path that leads towards greater consciousness, authenticity, meaning, and a soul truly alive and responsive to the full, complex, tragic, and beautiful tapestry of human existence. Maybe, just maybe, learning to face the potential trigger without the preemptive warning. Armed instead with developing inner resources, intellectual curiosity, and the courage to engage with the unknown is precisely the challenging medicine our contemporary souls most desperately need for genuine healing and growth. Thank you for watching this exploration, and until next time, take a moment to reflect on what truly nourishes your own inner life. Is it the constant pursuit of comfort and the avoidance of challenge, or is it the willingness to embrace the full spectrum of experience, shadows and all, in the service of becoming more whole?